The cowboy didn't stop because of the bread. He stopped because of something he saw in the woman holding it. The loaf hit the wooden floor with a dull thud. Laughter echoed through the crowded town hall as Nora stood frozen, her fingers still dusted with flour. Then a pair of worn cowboy boots stepped into the silence, and a rough hand reached for the forgotten bread. Before anyone understood why, he broke off a piece and took a bite. What had he noticed that everyone else had missed? Share where you're watching from as we begin. The crust broke with a hard, clean crack beneath Calhoun Reed's hands. Every voice inside the Clover Ridge Town Hall fell away. He stood before Nora Hale with her dark loaf between his palms, crumbs caught against the dust on his coat. Mrs. Gable's silver knife remained untouched on the judging table. The women beside her stared as Calhoun lifted the torn piece to his mouth. But that moment had begun before sunrise. Cold autumn mud clung to Nora's boots as she walked the 2 miles from her homestead into town. She carried the loaf beneath a square of white linen, holding it level with both hands. Above Clover Ridge, the mountains were already capped with snow. Chimney smoke hung beneath the clouds, too heavy to rise. Women passed her on the boardwalk carrying frosted cakes, pale biscuits, glass jars of preserves, and soft white loaves tied with ribbons. Their food looked made for company. Nora's looked built for winter. The loaf was broad and dark, with a rough crust and a faint dusting of flour across the top. She had made it from rye, wheat, salt, creek water, and the sourdough starter her mother had carried west from Ohio. That starter lived in a stoneware crock near Nora's stove. Fine cracks ran around its base now. Nora checked them each morning while the coffee boiled. She knew the vessel would not last forever, but replacing it felt too much like surrendering another piece of her mother. Her parents had been gone 3 years. Since then, Nora had managed the small homestead alone. She split her own wood, repaired her own fence rails, raised chickens, and traded eggs and soap for flour. Her hands bore small oven burns, pale lines from lye, and calluses thick enough to catch on cotton cloth. Some mornings, she still placed 2 cups on the table. She always put one back before the coffee cooled. Nora nearly left the fair loaf at home. Mrs. Gable's baking circle favored refined flour brought over the mountain road by freight wagon. They called dark bread camp food, hired hand food, something to fill a stomach, not grace a respectable table. But Nora remembered her mother pressing dough beneath strong brown hands. "Pretty food gets admired," she had once said. "Good food gets people through February." So Nora carried the loaf into town. At the fair, she placed it at the far end of the long judging table. Pale breads surrounded it in neat rows, smooth and nearly identical. Nora's loaf sat among them like a dark stone in fresh snow. Across the street, Calhoun Reed waited near the livery stable. He had come to Clover Ridge to inspect cattle before the mountain passes closed. Trail dust marked his hat and the knees of his trousers. He had noticed Nora on earlier visits, though they had exchanged little more than greetings. Once he had seen her walking home with a flour sack beneath one arm. Another time he had watched her set a fallen gate back on its hinges, while a ranch hand stood nearby offering help she did not need. That morning, Calhoun saw the care with which she carried the linen-wrapped loaf. He followed her into the hall. Mrs. Gable led the judges from one display to the next. She pressed each pale crust with her fingertips, cut tidy slices, and offered soft praise. "Even crumb. Fine rise. Lovely color." When she reached Nora's bread, she stopped. She did not lift the knife. One woman leaned closer and whispered that the loaf looked heavy enough to hold a barn door open. Another covered a laugh with her glove. Mrs. Gable studied the dark crust as though it had offended her. "Plain working food," she said. Then she moved on. Nora stood beside the table while every other baker received a ribbon, an honorable mention, or polite applause. Her name was never called. When the pie awards began, she wrapped the loaf again and carried it to a shadowed corner. She sat with it across her lap, waiting for the doorway to clear. Her chin remained high. Only her fingers betrayed her, pulling the linen tighter and tighter around the bread. Mr. Davies watched from beside the mercantile display, but he stayed with the town officials. Calhoun did not. He crossed the hall without looking at Mrs. Gable. Nora raised her eyes as he stopped before her. He took the loaf gently from her lap and folded back the linen. Then came the crack. The room went silent. Calhoun tore off a large piece and tasted it slowly. He chewed with the same grave attention he gave a horse's gait or the weight of a steer. Nora watched his face, unable to tell whether she should feel grateful or exposed. At last, he gave one firm nod. "That's the one I'm taking home." A murmur moved through the hall. The sentence seemed to settle over Nora in two different ways. Heat rose into her face. She looked down as Calhoun placed 2 coins in her palm, more than the loaf was worth. His fingers closed hers around them for only a moment. Then he wrapped the bread, tucked it beneath his arm, and walked out. Mrs. Gable stared after him. Mr. Davies watched Nora open her hand and look at the coins. She left through the rear door and walked home through the freezing mud. All the way back to the homestead, Calhoun's words followed her until they no longer sounded like words about bread. Before dawn the next morning, cattle bells drifted from the eastern road. Nora stepped onto the porch and saw riders moving through the gray light. Calhoun Reed was already leaving Clover Ridge. Later that day, a stable hand mentioned that Calhoun had finished his cattle business before the fair began. He had entered the town hall for no reason, except that he had seen Nora carrying the loaf inside. For the next week, Clover Ridge supplied its own explanations. Some said Calhoun Reed had meant to insult Mrs. Gable. Others claimed trailmen liked court food because they had ruined their taste on camp coffee and salt pork. A few women lowered their voices at the mercantile and suggested Nora had known exactly what she was doing when she brought that loaf into town. Nora heard every version. She answered none of them. She bought flour from Mr. Davies, carried it home beneath one arm, and returned to the life waiting beyond the last cottonwoods. Chickens still needed feeding. Soap still needed cutting. The loose board beside the shed still knocked in the wind. Calhoun's 2 coins went into the bottom of her mother's cracked crock. She did not spend them. Far east of Clover Ridge, Calhoun rode with a string of purchased cattle toward Crestfall. At the first night camp, he unwrapped what remained of Nora's bread. One rider asked where he had found it. "Woman named Nora Hale," Calhoun said. That was all. The loaf held better than the soft white bread packed by the hotel kitchen. 3 days later, it was still firm, still good, still carrying the dark taste of rye and smoke. Each time Calhoun tore off a piece, he saw Nora sitting alone in that shadowed corner while an entire room pretended not to notice. By the time the herd reached Crestfall, he had already worked out a return road through Clover Ridge. It added nearly 2 days. He took it anyway. Nora told herself she was not waiting. Still, whenever hoofbeats came along the eastern road, her hands paused over whatever work lay before her. Once she stepped all the way onto the porch before discovering only a freight wagon dragging chains through the mud. The first snow touched the mountains. No message came. Then, one cold afternoon, Nora was splitting kindling beside the shed when a shadow crossed the chopping block. She looked up. Calhoun stood near the gate, hat in hand. His buckskin horse waited behind him with trail dust caked above its hooves. "You always swing an axe that close to your foot?" he asked. "Only when strangers walk up quiet." A corner of his mouth moved. He glanced toward the well. "Ground freezing yet?" "Not deep." "You laid drainage?" Nora rested both hands on the axe handle. "Clover Ridge holding another cattle sale?" "No." The answer settled between them. Calhoun had no business in town. He had come to see her. Neither one said it. He walked the edge of the yard with the care of a man who noticed things for a living. The stacked wood, the clean chicken coop, the shallow trench around the well, the shed hinge sagging beneath a rusted pin. On the porch, sunlight caught the fine cracks circling her mother's crock. Nora moved slightly in front of it. Calhoun looked away. Before leaving, he took a hammer and square nail from his saddlebag and reset the shed hinge. He worked without asking, but not as though she could not have done it herself. When he finished, he brushed iron dust from his fingers. Should hold through winter. Nora wanted to ask whether he would return before then. Instead, she said, "Much obliged." He touched the brim of his hat and rode east. Another month passed. At church, Mrs. Gable remarked that wandering cattlemen had a way of stirring up hopes they never meant to answer for. Nora kept sewing. The needle snapped between her fingers. Near the first lasting snowfall, Calhoun returned again. A heavy burlap bundle was tied behind his saddle. He carried it onto the porch and set it carefully on the table. "What is it?" Nora asked. "Something I saw in Ridgeback." Inside the wrapping stood a dark brown stoneware crock with thick walls and a fitted lid. Nora looked from the new vessel to the cracked one beside the stove. Calhoun rubbed a thumb along the edge of his hat. Thought it might serve. He had noticed. Not the color of her dress. Not whether she smiled at him. The crack in the vessel that held the last living piece of her mother's kitchen. Nora lifted the new crock with both hands. It traveled all that way without breaking? Wrapped it better than I wrap myself. That drew a small laugh from her, quiet but real. Calhoun stayed on the porch while she transferred part of the starter. She spooned it slowly into the new vessel, leaving a little behind in the old crock. Past and future stood side by side. When she finished, Nora opened the door wider. "You eaten?" "Not since morning." "Then come in." It was the first time Calhoun crossed her threshold. After that, his visits found a rhythm neither of them named. He reset a loose gatepost. She mended the torn sleeve of his coat. He brought coffee beans from Crestfall. She packed bread and smoked meat for the road. Once they walked beside the creek where ice clung to the grass. Calhoun studied the south-facing slope. "Good place for a house," he said. Nora glanced at him. "Whose house?" He looked toward the mountains and did not answer. By early winter, freight drivers were asking Mr. Davies for Nora's rye bread. He ordered 6 loaves for the mercantile. They sold before noon. The next week, he ordered 12. For the first time since her parents died, Nora earned enough from the bread to pay for roof shingles without borrowing or accepting charity. That was when Mrs. Gable announced a new rule. Any food sold at the winter provisions market would require approval from her committee. She spoke of standards, cleanliness, and the safety of Clover Ridge families. The rule had not existed before Nora's bread began selling. Calhoun heard about it at the livery and came straight to the homestead. "I'll speak to her," he said. Nora turned from the stove. "No." His brow tightened. "You chose my bread once," she said. "You don't get to choose my words for me." Calhoun stood still for a moment. Then he nodded. "I can stand beside you. That'll do." At the town committee meeting 2 days later, Mrs. Gable placed a folded complaint on the table. She claimed Nora's cooking endangered Clover Ridge families. 3 respected townspeople had already signed it. The meeting was held in the same town hall where Nora's bread had been left untouched. Mrs. Gable sat behind a narrow table, with the complaint folded beneath one gloved hand. A coal stove ticked near the wall, but the room still carried the chill of wet coats and tracked-in snow. Nora entered with a flour ledger under her arm, a list of customers in her pocket, and 2 clean baking cloths folded over one wrist. Calhoun stood at the back. He had promised not to speak unless she asked. Mrs. Gable read the complaint slowly. The words sounded official enough: sanitation, public welfare, proper inspection. But every sentence pointed toward one kitchen. Nora waited until the paper was laid down. Then she opened her ledger She showed the dates flour had been purchased from Mr. Davies, the number of loaves baked, and the names of freight drivers who had carried them east. Mr. Davies confirmed that no customer had reported illness. Two teamsters spoke from the doorway, hats turning in their hands, and said Nora's bread stayed sound long after softer loaves had gone stale. Mrs. Gable looked past them. "A woman living alone," she said, "may not always recognize when proper supervision is needed." Calhoun's jaw tightened. Nora did not look back at him. She placed both hands flat on the table. The scars from the oven showed pale against her skin. "I have kept a roof standing through 3 winters," she said. "I have pulled water when the well rope froze, delivered calves in sleet, preserved meat without losing a jar, and buried both my parents without letting their land fall to ruin. I know when a kitchen is clean." No one moved. When Calhoun was finally called, he gave only what Nora had allowed him to give. "Her kitchen is cleaner than most ranch houses," he said. "Cleaner than every cattle camp I've worked." The committee found no cause to bar Nora from the market. Written rules would apply to every baker in Clover Ridge, not only one. Nora gathered her papers without smiling. At the winter market, her loaves sold before noon. She did not place a sign over the table. She did not look toward Mrs. Gable's pale breads. She simply cut another dark loaf while customers waited with coins ready. Calhoun watched her from across the room. He had mistaken her silence for softness once. He knew better now. A week later, Mr. Davies came to Nora's homestead after church. He brought a small bundle of asters from the dried plants his late wife had tended behind the mercantile. Nora set them in a blue glass jar. Mr. Davies did not pretend the visit concerned flour. He spoke plainly about the rooms above his store, the warmth of the brick chimney, and the ease of living close to town. He said 2 sensible people need not remain alone merely because grief had made a habit of it. Nora respected him for saying what he meant. His offer held no mystery, no Eastern road, no month-long silences. Still, when he praised her reliability, he spoke of how well she might manage his household. He did not ask whether she intended to keep baking for trail crews. He assumed the homestead would be sold. When he noticed the new stoneware crock, he called it handsome. He never asked why the old cracked one remained beside it. That was when Calhoun arrived. Mr. Davies stepped onto the porch as Calhoun came through the gate. The 2 men exchanged quiet greetings. Calhoun's eyes moved past him. He saw the asters in the window. A second coffee cup stood on Nora's table. Something in his face closed. "The Eastern road may shut by nightfall," he said. Nora waited for more. None came. He stayed only long enough to ask whether her roof patch had held, then touched his hat and walked back to his horse. Nora stood in the doorway as he rode away. For months he had returned with coffee, nails, bread sacks, and unfinished thoughts. Now another man had spoken clearly, and Calhoun had answered by leaving. She took the asters from the window, but did not throw them out. Mr. Davies had done nothing wrong. At a cattle camp beyond Clover Ridge, Calhoun sharpened a draw knife beside the fire. An older trail hand noticed the carpenter's tools in his bedroll and the folded measurements tucked into his coat. "What kind of cattle buyer carries window widths?" the man asked. Calhoun looked down at the paper. On it was a rough sketch of the slope beside Nora's creek. A kitchen faced east. A porch faced the mountains. He had planned every board except the words needed to ask her. Calhoun rose before the coffee finished boiling. He meant to return. The storm reached Clover Ridge first. Clouds rolled down from the pass, dark and low. Ice struck the windows. Wind bent the cottonwoods until their bare limbs scraped together like dry bones. At the homestead, Nora latched the chicken coop, drew extra water, and banked the stove. A board tore loose above the storage shed with a crack like a rifle shot. She carried a lantern outside to secure the feed sacks. The wind caught the shed door. The lantern struck the wall. Flame ran through the dry straw. Nora freed the chickens and dragged one sack clear. A burning beam dropped across her path. Another came down behind it and pinned her leg beneath the edge of the roof. Snow thickened around the yard, hiding the smoke from town. Several miles east, Calhoun rode with the cattle party. Then he looked back. A low black smear moved beneath the storm clouds in the direction of Nora's land. The contract ahead of him represented years of savings. He pulled his buckskin around anyway. By the time he reached the homestead, the shed was burning hard. The house door stood open. Snow erased every mark except a line of Nora's footprints. They ended beneath the fallen roof. Calhoun threw himself from the saddle and called her name. For one terrible moment, the wind answered. Then he heard a dull knock beneath the broken timbers. 3 strikes, a pause, 3 more. He followed the sound through smoke and blowing snow. Nora lay on her side beneath a fallen beam, one leg trapped under the edge of the roof. She had found a loose board and was striking it against the frozen ground. "I'm here," Calhoun said. Her face tightened when she saw him, though whether from relief or pain he could not tell. The beam would not lift by hand. Calhoun dragged a fence rail from beside the chicken yard, wedged it beneath the timber, and leaned his full weight against it. "Pull when I tell you." The rail groaned. The beam rose barely enough. "Now." Nora dragged herself free as sparks blew across the snow. Calhoun caught her beneath the arms and lifted her before the roof settled again. "The crocks," she said. He carried her toward the house. "Calhoun, the starter." "I heard you." He set her beside the stove, wrapped a wool blanket around her shoulders, and ran back into the smoke. The shelf had fallen. Nora's mother's crock lay in pieces across the floor, its cracked sides broken open at last. Beside it, the new brown vessel rested beneath a blackened board. Soot covered the lid, but the thick walls had held. Calhoun tucked it beneath his coat and gathered the largest fragment of the old crock before the heat drove him outside. Nora was waiting on the kitchen floor when he returned. He placed the new vessel before her. With her uninjured hand, she lifted the lid. The sourdough starter still breathed beneath a thin layer of flour. For several seconds, Nora said nothing. Then she saw the curved piece of old stoneware in Calhoun's palm. She took it carefully. Her thumb traced the faded blue mark near the rim where her mother's hand had rested for years. Calhoun did not tell her it was only a crock. He did not ask her to be grateful for what had survived. He set the broken piece beside the living starter. Outside, the shed roof collapsed with a low roar. Snow sealed the road before dark. Calhoun boarded the kitchen window with planks torn from the damaged porch and braced the weakest roof beam with a length of fence timber. Nora's palm had blistered beneath the torn glove, and her leg would not bear her weight. He heated water, wrapped her hand in clean cloth, and made broth from onions, dried beans, and the last strip of salt pork. The house creaked through the night. Wind pressed snow beneath the door. Calhoun slept in a chair near the stove with his boots on, and his coat folded beneath his head. Nora woke before dawn and found him feeding the fire with broken boards from her shed. His coat hung near the hearth, one sleeve still bearing the careful stitches she had sewn weeks earlier. Near the chair, his saddlebag stood open. Inside lay measuring twine, carpenter's nails, and a folded sheet of paper. Nora reached for it. Calhoun came through the doorway carrying an armful of wood. He saw the paper in her hand and stopped. On it was a rough drawing of the south-facing slope beside the creek. A kitchen window faced the morning light. A porch stretched towards the mountains. He took the paper gently and folded it again. Neither spoke of it that day. By the second evening, the storm had buried the lower fence rails. Calhoun poured coffee into 2 tin cups. Nora sat near the stove with her injured leg propped on a stool. "Why do you keep coming back?" she asked. He looked into his cup. "I worry about you." "Worry is not a promise." His fingers tightened around the tin. "I've never been good at staying. I never asked you to stay everywhere." He raised his eyes. Nora held them. I asked whether you mean to stay with me. The stove popped between them. Calhoun looked toward the dark window. Nora's voice lowered. Mr. Davies has spoken of marriage. The cup stopped halfway to Calhoun's mouth. He has offered me a clear life, she continued. A warm house, a place in town. He says what he means. Calhoun set the coffee down. I have obligations east. The consortium owns my time through spring. My savings are tied up in the cattle contract. Nora looked at the fire. He has offered me a future. You have offered me another visit. I've been slow. You have been silent. Calhoun unfolded the drawing at last. The slope by the creek gets sun first, he said. A kitchen there would warm before the barn. The porch could face west, toward the ridge. Nora studied the careful lines. Whose house is it? His mouth opened. No answer came. The silence that followed was heavier than the silence in the town hall. On the third morning, the wind died. Sunlight spread across the snow, bright enough to hurt the eyes. Calhoun dug out the door, repaired the frozen well crank, and stacked enough wood beside the stove to last several days. Nora waited on the porch while he saddled his horse. She expected him to speak before putting his boot in the stirrup. Instead, he pulled on his gloves. I have to settle something, he said. Then I'll come back. She heard only another leaving. Nora did not ask what he meant. Calhoun touched the brim of his hat and rode toward Clover Ridge. She watched until he disappeared behind the cottonwoods. Then she carried Mr. Davies's dried asters outside and opened her hand. The petals scattered across the snow. Mr. Davies came the following afternoon with flour, lamp oil, and 2 sheets of tin for the damaged roof. He asked no questions about Calhoun. Before leaving, he told Nora he would ask for her answer at the next provisions market. She looked toward the empty eastern road. Waiting forever, she decided, would be another way of surrendering her life. No message came from Calhoun. No rider appeared. Then, on the morning Nora intended to answer Mr. Davies, 6 lumber wagons rolled into Clover Ridge. Every board bore Calhoun Reed's name. The wagons came slowly over the frozen road, wheels groaning beneath cut pine, window glass, roofing tin, kegs of nails, and a black cast-iron stove wrapped in canvas. Men stepped from the mercantile to watch. One driver climbed down and unfolded a receipt. Which way to the Reed parcel beside Nora Hale's creek? Nora stood beneath the awning with her injured hand bandaged against her coat. There is no Reed parcel. The driver looked at the paper again. Bob, bought 3 days ago. At the land office, Nora found Calhoun's name written in fresh ink beneath the description of the south-facing acreage adjoining her homestead. The clerk explained that Calhoun had ridden in the morning after the storm. He had sold his share of the eastern cattle contract at a loss, paid for the land, then continued toward Ridgeback before the mountain road closed again. He had not ridden away from her. He had ridden toward the promise he had been unable to speak. Mr. Davies found Nora beside the wagons, watching men unload the stove. He understood before she said anything. I could offer you a quiet life, he said. Warm rooms, a sensible arrangement. Nora lowered her eyes. Mr. Davies gave a weary smile. But you would still listen for the eastern road. She looked at him then. He removed his hat. A sensible match can make a quiet house. It cannot always make a home. Nora thanked him without pretending his kindness had meant nothing. He nodded once and returned to the mercantile, leaving her with her answer before he had asked the question. That afternoon, Nora carried 12 dark loaves into the winter provisions market. Her burned hand made lifting the basket difficult, but she refused help until Mr. Davies silently held the door. Inside, she placed the bread at the center of her table, not at the far end. Mrs. Gable glanced toward the bandage and then toward the loaves. I had heard the storm ended your baking. It delayed it. Customers formed a line before the market bell finished ringing. The doors opened again. Calhoun Reed stepped inside. Snow had dried white along his boots, his coat carried mountain dust, and his face looked drawn from hard riding. He held no flowers, no package, no tool in his hands, only his hat. The hall quieted. Calhoun stopped before Nora's table but did not touch the bread. "Will you hear me before you send me away?" Nora folded the cloth over the nearest loaf. "I'm listening." He looked around the room once, then back at her. "I thought coming back was enough. Thought fixing a hinge, bringing a crock, drawing a house I was too afraid to name would tell you what I meant." His voice stayed low, but no one moved. "It did not," Nora said. "No." He accepted the word without defense. "The storm did not make me love you. It only made plain what I had been avoiding. Every road I took, I measured by how soon it brought me back here." Nora's fingers tightened on the linen. Calhoun stepped closer. "I knew your bread was worth carrying home the first day I tasted it. Took me longer to understand that home was wherever you were." Nora glanced toward the frosted windows. "You bought land because of the fire?" "No." "Because of Mr. Davies?" "No." "Then why?" "Because I do not want a life made only of departures." The hall remained still. Nora lifted her chin. "What happens to my homestead? My baking? My mother's starter?" Calhoun answered without hesitation this time. "Nothing happens to them unless you choose it. I am not asking you to leave the life you built." He took one slow breath. "I want to build beside it, if you'll let me." Nora studied the man who had once spoken boldly before a crowded hall, and then spent months hiding behind quiet acts. "You finally found your words," she said. "Took me stopping long enough to hear them." Her face softened. Then Nora placed her uninjured hand in his. Mrs. Gable cleared her throat and remarked that a public market was hardly the place for private declarations. Nora turned toward her. "This room was public enough when my bread was laughed at." Mr. Davies stepped forward, laid a coin on Nora's table, and took the first loaf. Others followed. By spring, the house beside the creek had begun to rise. Calhoun stayed above the livery until their wedding. He and Nora marked the foundation together. The kitchen faced the morning sun. The porch looked toward the mountains. The barn stood above the floodline. Nora kept her old homestead and turned it into a bakehouse. Calhoun shortened his cattle routes, but he did not abandon them. Each adjusted without erasing the other. Before the spring supper, Mrs. Gable came to Nora's kitchen and ordered 6 rye loaves for families traveling into the mountains. She tasted one slice at last. "It holds longer than ours," she admitted. Nora covered the loaf with linen. It was made to. They were married in the same hall where Nora's bread had once been left, untouched. She wore dark blue muslin. Calhoun wore a borrowed suit and looked uncomfortable until she took his hand. At the center of the wedding table sat a broad, dark loaf. 5 years later, the house beside the creek had weathered silver gray. Roses climbed the porch posts. Nora's bakehouse supplied the mercantile, cattle crews, and travelers bound for Ridgeback. Their son watched a beetle near the steps. Their daughter stacked smooth stones beside the garden. At sunset, Nora and Calhoun sat together with a plate of rye bread between them. Calhoun tasted a slice with the same solemn expression he had worn at the harvest fair. "Still the best bread in 3 counties. Marriage made you biased. I said it before you agreed to marry me." Above the kitchen hearth, a piece of Nora's mother's broken crock had been set into the stone. Beneath it, the new crock held the living starter. Clover Ridge remembered the day Calhoun Reed chose the loaf everyone else had laughed at. Nora remembered the greater choice, the day he stopped treating love like a road he could visit, and finally built his home beside hers. Maybe that's why their story lingered long after the seasons passed. It was never really about bread. It was about seeing the quiet worth in someone the world had overlooked. It was about learning that love isn't measured by grand speeches or perfect timing, but by the decision to return, to stay, and to build something strong enough to weather every winter together. If you've ever wondered whether your quiet efforts mattered, or whether anyone truly noticed the care you poured into ordinary days, I hope Nora's journey stays with you. Sometimes the things that seem plain to everyone else become the very things that carry a family through the hardest seasons. And sometimes the person meant for you doesn't arrive with perfect words. They arrive with steady hands, an honest heart, and the courage to keep choosing you. Take a moment and imagine yourself standing in Nora's kitchen as the evening light settles over the creek. Would you have trusted Calhoun one last time, or would you have chosen the safer path? I'd truly enjoy reading your thoughts, so share them in the comments. If stories like this remind you that kindness, resilience, and faithful love still have a place in this world, I hope you'll join me again. There are many more journeys waiting just beyond the next trail. Stories of healing, hope, and hearts finding their way home when they least expect it.